everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the D&D Delver. So I'm Lexi, and I'm the young adult librarian over at the Tomball Harris County Public Library. And so today I figured I've done an episode for first-time players, so why not first-time DMs? So this episode's going to be a little bit different because it's not going to be me telling you so much as to how to DM as so much as things you should take into consideration before you decide to be a DM. Because there's a lot that kind of goes into it that I think people and myself didn't really take into consideration prior to stepping up and saying, yeah, I want to DM. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my very short-lived experience as a dungeon master. And there's a lot that kind of goes into it prior to being a DM. And there's some things that you kind of, like myself, I kind of look back at and I'm like, well, maybe I probably should have taken this into consideration a bit more than I had. So these are just kind of be like little tips and tricks and rundowns of things that you may need or things that you may want to kind of look at prior to stepping up and DMing. So I guess I'm just going to go ahead and start with, so you want to be a DM? Okay, that's awesome. What type of game do you want to be a dungeon master for? That should be your biggest question because there's a lot that goes into that question. So first of all, do you want to play a game that is homebrew or do you want to play a game that's modular? A modular game is very much, you have the book, you bought the book, everything's in there that you need, maps, dialogue, setup, everything's right there in your hands, and then you have your homebrew games, which are very much you make it. And I am very much of the mindset for Dungeons and Dragons that there really is no limit to this game except your imagination. Because it is a role-playing game and it is tabletop, it is not like a video game. It doesn't have to be a unilateral path unless you want it to be. Now, if you want it to be and your players want it to be, that's great. I mean, that's just your play style and that's how it goes down. That's awesome. But you have to take that into consideration because if you want a very unilateral directed game, your players, on the other hand, may not enjoy that so much. Or you may want to play a freelance, like, the world is your oyster. It's like Skyrim. You can do whatever you want type of game. And again, your players may not like that type of feel. So that kind of comes into consideration. What would make you happiest? Would you want to homebrew a game or would you want to play a modular game? Now, this isn't saying it's either or, because you can very much take a modular game and make it into something that's homebrew. But since you are a dungeon master and D&D is very much a cooperative game, you have to take into consideration, are your players okay with homebrew? Because you can make your own monsters, you can make your own effects and situations, and I know a lot of people who don't like homebrew games because of how open and vast it is and how very not unilateral, or how it's not consistent, or how it's not by the rule book. So I know a lot of players like that who are just, they're unhappy, honestly, in a homebrew game. And that's fine, because that just comes down to play styles. So you really have to think about what you want as well as what players you're going to have at your table are going to want. My best advice, choose players that are going to want the same thing as you. If you're going to want to have this wide, vast homebrew game with all these different effects and monsters and wackadoodle things, that's great. but you have to be sure that your players are okay with that too, because if you bring a person who is very much, I want this to be by the book, straight D&D stuff, they're not going to have a good time at your table, and that is going to affect everyone. So it's, like I said, there's going to be a lot that I'm going to kind of be going over here, that it's, you have to take these things into consideration, because if you don't, it can affect kind of the mood and the atmosphere at the table. And you really want to, especially as a dungeon master, you are in this type of leadership role, because players are going to be looking at you to make the final call on decisions, as well as to basically bring the peace to the table. If you have discrepancy with players, or players are having discrepancies within themselves, it's going to be up to you to kind of help resolve and smooth over that situation, especially if it's in game. So, like I said, consider what type of game you want to play. So let's see. I guess this also comes down to, as I was saying, who do you want to bring to your table? Now, let's say you got into a game, you decided, I'm going to go join up with this group on Facebook, and I had a really great time with them, and now we're friends, we all do this D&D thing together, and the game you guys are running is very unilateral with a couple other minor side quests. But you want to run a game that's going to be more open and vast. And you kind of want to step up and be a DM. Now, that's something you got to kind of discuss with your players, is what are they looking for in a game? Do they want a serious game? Do they want something silly? Do they want kind of a balance or a mix of both? I know in several campaigns I've played in, as well as DM'd for, we typically have a couple players that want to just have pure chaos, and then we have one player who wants a very serious game, and then you're going to have other players that are just fine with whatever happens. Whatever happens. But if you're going to be having a very diverse and mixed group as to what they're looking for in a game, you're going to run into some cohesive problems. So, like, people who just want to do chaos and run around in the open world and, like, still have some type of a story and pursue that story, but at the same time not getting bothered by the fact, oh, these are these other quests, these are other people that we can interact with, and they don't mind those types of things coming up in the game. You're gonna have and then you're gonna have a person who's super serious, wants everything to be very, okay, next task, and they're gonna get bothered by all those things that are coming up, and things that are basically, they're gonna see them as distractions, because they want to play a serious game, and with the serious game comes next task type of situation. Or if you're just playing a gritty game, I know a lot of people who are not okay with kind of dark and gruely games. Usually there is some type of invisible line that a lot of people try not to cross when it comes to those dark and grueling games. But like I said, if you're going to step up to a table and the table thinks you're going to be playing this happy-go-lucky game and everything's going to be fun and cheery and wackadoodle, and you bring to the table this very dark, grim, Arkham style game, they're probably going to be like, well, what's all this, you know? So it really comes down to, I would recommend, this is just my personal recommendation, be sure the people you are playing with and the people you are bringing to the table are on the same page as you, as well as being happy about being on that same page. Because if you have people who can agree to be like, yeah, okay, I'm fine with being in a homebrew game, but then they're sitting at the table looking up stats of a monster or looking up things, and they're like, well, this doesn't line up, or what's this? You know, and they're questioning everything. That's signs that they're really not okay with being in a homebrew game, and that they really should be running a modular based game. Or they should be playing in a modular based game, or something that is more, I guess, by the book, quote unquote. And again, these aren't my personal beliefs on a lot of this, because like I've said before, and I stated at the very beginning of this video, I am very much of the mindset that D&D, imagination is your limitation, because it's a tabletop role-playing game. I mean, come on. It's not a video game. You can make it whatever you want it to be. And to me, that's the beauty of it. So I guess I'll go ahead and move on to a couple things that you may kind of want or need at the table as a DM. As a DM, one of the biggest things is, do you want to have a Dungeon Master screen? Basically, I'm sure a lot of you know what that is. It's the thing that the DM props up in front so you can't see anything going on behind it. A lot of people prefer having the screen. But there are a handful of people out there that don't like having the screen. They like having kind of that transparency, or that feeling of they're not fudging rolls type of thing, which is completely fine. Comes down to play style yet again. But there are benefits and cons to everything. So having the Dungeon Master screen allows you to fudge those rolls when you think it is crucial, and I mean crucial, to the storyline or for a player development. So I mean, those are some calls you're gonna have to make if you do have a DM screen. Now, I wouldn't be like super obvious that you fudged rolls, because obviously that takes away from a player's, I guess, it takes away from the achievement factor from the player. So it's one of those things you'll have to take into consideration. Now, if you don't have a DM screen, benefits are your players know you're not fudging rolls, and they know if they miss that attack, it's because they really missed that attack. Downside is when you need to fudge those rolls for those crucial moments, you can't. And then you have to find another workaround in order to develop that. So you just have to decide what your play style is going to be, and if it lines up with who you're bringing to the table. I think my kind of biggest recommendation now is make sure you're bringing players to the table that are happy to be on the same page as you, not just okay with. The more cohesive your group is, the more you're going to be able to have a very fun and joyous atmosphere without having to try very hard. So it's just kind of one of those things. That's a really big thing, actually. So you can most certainly be friends with people and not have the same play style. I see that a lot. And it doesn't mean that people who don't have the same play style can't come to love or enjoy your play style, or vice versa. It's just saying it makes it easier. And it also avoids a lot of toxic groups that you hear some people talking about, especially once you get involved in the D&D community. So the more cohesive the group, the more thought you put into it, definitely kind of helps avoid a lot of drama and pitfalls later on. So I guess I'll go ahead, and I think the last kind of thing I'm going to go over here, and this video is going to be a little bit shorter than my past D&D Delvers, only because, like I said, I don't put too much I guess, faith or experience into telling you how to run a game. That's not something that's enjoyable for me. I love to write. So for me, homebrew games are always going to be my go-to. I can't really do modular games because I don't feel as though the majority of them are very. I don't feel as though they're very character driven. So I guess the last thing I'm going to go ahead and go over is what you may need to DM. So as I said before, you're probably going to need a DM screen if you choose that to be your path. Great. If not, that's fine too. Whatever you want to do. Secondly, regardless if you're playing homebrew or modular base, I always recommend you have a Dungeon Master's Guide and a Monster's Manual. Now, I say this because even though you may be playing a modular game and it has it all right there, there may be things you want to throw in that are not particularly in that story, but they are in the Monster Manual. And it's really kind of a great way to, and a lot of people that I know of that do homebrew games, including myself, will take monsters out of the Monster Manual if you're doing a homebrew game, like I said before. If you're doing a Monster Manual, you go through, you pick a creature that you really like, and then you can either choose to beef it up or beef it down or reskin it or give it things, and it just you kind of get that opportunity to make it into your own creature. But if you're playing a modular game, it also gives you more options to throw things into the game that are not just in the modular. So I always recommend the Monster Manual and the DMG. So the DMG is, in all honesty, I haven't read through it all. It's a really hefty read. And you really, really don't need to read the Player's Handbook or the DMG or any of these books cover to cover. And I only say that because it's a lot of information. And especially if you're a first-time player or first-time DM, it is super overwhelming. I remember when I first started playing, I thought I needed to read the Player's Handbook cover to cover, and I was just like, I can't do that. Lucky enough, I had a DM who was really great, walked me through everything that I needed to be walked through. But yeah, you really don't need to read them cover to cover, but it is a really good reference book to have. So with the DMG, it is very much, it gives you other elements of the games that you can take into consideration while playing. So you have like exhaustion. I don't think this is in the DMG, but it also gives you some other alternatives like magic items, which is a big one, and a couple of alternative rules that you can put in. Something else I was going to recommend, but I think this is homebrew, is basically an advanced version of a spell. Basically, if you were to cast a fire and a cold one, it would cause an explosion type of thing. But I believe that's a homebrew alchemist action. And so with the DMG, that's pretty much what I recommend with it. You don't have to read it cover to cover, but it's a really good reference point to have, and it's really reliable. It also gives you other alternatives such as different planes, different dimensions, and it really gets into that type of stuff too. It's not just a rule book, it also gives you alternative plot lines, stories. It teaches you how to build a village, how to build a town. That's the other thing with the DMG. It is very much taking into consideration just the Dungeons and Dragons world and realm. So if you're homebrewing, it has a lot of great ideas for you to springboard off of, but they may not necessarily be the ones that you stick with, since it is very much all cohesive with the D&D lore, the D&D style, D&D setting. So if you're homebrewing a game, they're great base boards, even if that. And then, of course, the very last thing you're gonna need is dice, all the dice. Especially if you're starting off at a high level. If you're starting off at a low level, you may not need that many, but you're gonna need a lot of dice as a DM, or else you're gonna be there for a cool minute rolling one set of die. But yeah, I think that was pretty much everything I wanted to go over in this section. I would just, like I've said before, I would just really recommend like staying focused on what you guys are looking for in a group, what you guys are looking for to get out of a story, and really just kind of take it into consideration. I know a lot of people, and myself included, so for me, I had an idea of what I wanted to do, and like I started making maps, and that may be something I go over next week. But I started making maps, I started making a story, and I really just, I got into it, but like I didn't have a group at the time, and so I'm a very shy type of person. So I was actually kind of thrown into being the DM for a couple of my friends. And I mean, my personal experience as a DM, I can't really say I've had any really bad experiences. I've had a couple players whose playstyle does not line up with the way I DM. That's fine. I mean, it didn't bother me any. But they also knew when they came to the table what type of game they were coming into. So it was very much at that point where it was like, yeah, we're enjoying the game and the interactions and everything, but there were a few points where I could tell it was like, well, this kind of bugs me because it's not how it is in the book type of situation. But like I said before, they knew the rules when they came into it. And yeah, I mean, that was pretty much my experience as a DM. Now, I did ask the community a little bit about kind of, you know, what would be their reaction to a person who wants to play D&D. What would you tell them? And I was actually really surprised by this response, and it kind of made me sad a little bit. But their response was pretty much, don't stay in a toxic group. Even as a DM or a player, you don't need to stay in a toxic group. There are plenty others out there, and you can find many, many more. If it's a play style that you are uncomfortable with, don't feel as though you've had to stay. I've had that happen once or twice, and it's fine. It's just because other people like that type of play style doesn't mean you have to. And I know several people who have walked away from a table because of that as well. So it's very much, don't force yourself into a situation that you don't need to be in. It's completely unnecessary. And you have other alternatives, like maybe your public library, such as Tomball, offers a public and free service for which you guys can come and play D&D at. So, I mean, it's just really, I was so sad to see that. That was disappointing, it really was. But yeah, the community, a lot of them have also said you don't need to read the books cover to cover. Because again, things may change when you sit down at a table, especially if you're playing in a homebrew game. Of course, the basic rules and concepts will still apply, but other than that, everything else in that book, there's a lot in these books, guys, and don't let anybody tell you otherwise. And it can be really overwhelming. So don't feel as though you need to read them cover to cover, because that's not the case. anybody who tells you otherwise, you might want to second guess that recommendation. Um, but yeah, I mean, really, you don't need to read it from cover to cover. Just do you, and you should be in a group that is okay with teaching you, especially if you're a new DM or a new player. You definitely need to be in a group where they are okay with teaching you things. I mean, the majority of people I know in the D&D community are more than happy to help a new person out. But if you're in a group and you're a new player and they're not willing to help you, that might be a red flag that you want to look at, and you might want to reconsider staying with that group. I always recommend, if there's any big red flags to you, bow out while you can versus sticking around until there's just toxicity everywhere, because that is eventually what will happen. So take care of yourself, take care of others. Really, it's not that hard. Common decency with these games, guys, and that's pretty much. Oh, one last tip as a DM: always make your rulings fair. That is a very last and final tip I'm going to give people. Only because there may be situations you may get into, and stay consistent. So if you get into a situation and you give ruling A, but later you get into a very similar or exact situation and you give it ruling B, you're going to have players at the table who notice that, and they're going to be thinking why. So you as a DM, you may be sitting there thinking, well, I made this ruling because it drove story, it drove character development, it made for a funny story or silly story or whatever you're trying to go for at the time, but your players may not comprehend that. So let's say ruling A was a by the book ruling, but ruling B was a ruling you made to drive story. It's really hard to make those calls as a DM, because if you make a ruling for the story, you can't explain that to your players, because then you give away part of your story. So it's a really great area, and it makes it a lot simpler if you just stay consistent. I mean, you can always work around it if it's really that crucial, that important, then I'm sure, and if it's that big of a deal, I'm sure your players are already feeling like they're in a big fight or something, or it's already a big deal. So just kind of keep that in mind. Try to stay consistent with your rulings, because some people may misinterpret that, even though you're sitting here thinking, okay, this is going to drive story for XYZ. Your players may be sitting at the table looking at it as though it's favoritism, and you really want to kind of avoid that. So stay consistent in rulings. That's going to be my last tip. Alrighty, I will see you all next week, same time, same place. Bye-bye.